Hours before his world collapsed, Nicolas Maduro was smiling, shaking hands, calling China a brother. And then, in a single shocking move, the United States seized him. This was not just the removal of a Latin American strongman. It was a message, a demonstration of power so blunt that it sent tremors far beyond Caracas all the way to Beijing. Because Venezuela is not just oil-rich, it is debt-laden. It is strategically placed, and it is one of China's most important all-weather partners in the Western Hemisphere. When Donald Trump acted, China heard something loud and clear. If sovereignty can be overridden once, it can be overridden again. If you want to understand how global power is really exercised today, not in speeches, but in force, stay with me. Because this moment is not about Maduro. It's about what happens when empires collide, and it's only the beginning. To understand why this moment matters so much, we have to clarify what is really at stake. What exactly is at the center of this crisis? On the surface, it looks like regime change. A US president removing a hostile leader. A familiar story in Latin America. But beneath that surface lies something far more consequential. Venezuela is a financial node in China's global strategy. Over 2 decades, Beijing extended massive loans tied not to ideology, but to oil. Caracas became one of China's largest debtors, and China became its most patient creditor. That relationship was built on a principle. China values deeply non-interference. No lectures, no regime change, only contracts, commodities, and time. Trump's move shattered that assumption. Now Beijing faces a question it has long tried to avoid. What happens to Chinese money when American power redraws political reality overnight? This is why China condemned the seizure so forcefully, not out of sentiment for Maduro, but out of fear for the precedent. And to grasp how we arrived at this dangerous point, we need to step back into the history that made Venezuela so vulnerable. For years, Venezuela sat at the intersection of oil, debt, and geopolitics. As US influence in the country declined, China moved in not with troops, but with capital. Beijing extended loans on an enormous scale structured around future oil deliveries. It was a cycle. Cash today, crude tomorrow. Between 2000 and 2023, Venezuela became the 4th largest recipient of Chinese official lending. More than $100 billion in commitments. A financial relationship that bound the two countries together through boom and bust. For China, this was part of a broader strategy. Expand trade, deepen diplomacy, challenge US dominance in its own hemisphere, quietly, economically, patiently. For Venezuela, it was survival. But debt has gravity. As oil production struggled and obligations mounted, leverage shifted, not in Caracas, but in Beijing and Washington. By 2024, Venezuela still owed China billions. And suddenly, the political system holding those debts together collapsed. When that structure broke, it triggered the first true rupture, one that exposed how fragile China's position really was. The first rupture came fast. A tanker bound for China, carrying Venezuelan oil, seized by US forces. This was not just enforcement, it was escalation. For years, oil had been the lubricant of China-Venezuela relations. Loans were repaid not in cash, but in crude. Tankers moving quietly across oceans were the real currency of trust. When one of those tankers was intercepted, the message was unmistakable. Even oil flows can be weaponized. And that is when concern in Beijing turned into alarm. Because Venezuelan oil is not essential to China's energy security. It makes up only a small share of total imports. What matters far more is the debt behind it and who gets paid first when a government collapses. If US pressure reshuffles creditor priorities, Chinese banks could absorb heavy losses. This is why China's regulators moved quickly. Why major lenders were asked to report their exposure. If you want to understand modern power, watch the money and who controls its movement. But the deeper danger for China lies not in any single seizure, it lies in the system that made it possible. Behind this crisis sits a quiet but brutal mechanism: creditor hierarchy. When governments fall, debts do not disappear. They are reordered. Venezuela is indebted to many actors, domestic, foreign, public, private, but power decides who stands at the front of the line. If a new government in Caracas emerges under US pressure, it may prioritize American claims, not because of law, but because of leverage. That is the fear gripping Beijing. Chinese lending was built on stability, continuity, and time. It assumed governments might struggle but would endure. Trump's intervention shattered that assumption. Now, Chinese banks face the possibility of being pushed back, of watching oil revenues redirected, of absorbing losses not through market failure but political force. China does have tools: rare earth exports, trade leverage, debt restructuring proposals that stretch payments and lower interest. But using them risks escalation at a moment when US-China relations are already strained. This is the paradox China faces: economic power without political control. And as this system tightens, pressure does not dissipate, it accelerates toward a second, far more dangerous crisis. The second crisis is not financial, it is political. Donald Trump has said the United States will run Venezuela, not occupy it, but control it. Whether through direct oversight or a pliant government in Caracas, the result is the same: decision-making shifts outward. For China, this changes everything. If Venezuela becomes a US-managed state, Beijing is no longer negotiating with the debtor. It is negotiating around American power in the middle of an already volatile trade war. The uncertainty is profound. Will new leaders honor agreements signed under Maduro? Or will those contracts be dismissed as relics of a fallen regime? China's scholars see the risk clearly. If debts are ignored, Beijing's options narrow to litigation, slow, public, and politically fraught. Meanwhile, Washington signals its own leverage: control oil exports, hold reconstruction hostage, use Venezuela's reserves as bargaining chips. This is escalation without tanks, coercion without invasion. And for China, it represents a strategic shock: influence built over decades, challenged in days. But beyond strategy and power, there is another layer, one that touches ordinary lives, including yours. Now, let me speak directly to you, because this is not just a chess match between Washington and Beijing. It reaches into the lives of ordinary people and the systems you depend on. When great powers fight over debt, oil, and control, stability is the first casualty. Prices fluctuate, supply chains tighten. Markets react long before politicians explain. For Venezuelans, the uncertainty is existential. A sudden change in power means contracts questioned, salaries frozen, futures suspended. For you watching from afar, the lesson is more uncomfortable. Global order is not protected by rules alone. It is protected by power, and power can move suddenly. If sovereignty can be overridden in one country, it reshapes expectations everywhere. Investors grow cautious. Governments hedge. Trust erodes. This is why moments like this matter. They reveal how fragile the world really is. If you want clearer, deeper analysis of how global power affects your life, stay with me, because what happens next will not stop at Venezuela's borders, it will ripple outward. The shockwaves from Venezuela travel far beyond Latin America. For years, China has invested heavily in the region, not just with money, but with diplomacy. Trade between China and Latin America reached record levels. Dialogue forums multiplied. Influence deepened quietly. Trump's intervention disrupts that trajectory. If a key Chinese partner can be forcibly removed, others will take note. Not just in Latin America, but across the developing world. Governments that accepted Chinese loans will now reassess their risk. Not of default, but of intervention. At the same time, Washington reasserts an older doctrine: This is its neighborhood, and it is willing to use force to prove it. Beijing, in response, frames the issue as principle, opposition to a world where one country acts as judge and enforcer, but principle alone does not protect assets. What is at stake is credibility. China's promise that economic partnership offers insulation from political upheaval. If that promise weakens, China's global model weakens with it. So where does this leave the future, not just for Venezuela, but for the balance of power itself? From this point forward, three futures begin to take shape. The first is managed accommodation. A new government in Caracas seeks stability. China restructures debt, longer timelines, lower interest. Oil revenues are split in a way that avoids open confrontation. Losses are contained, tension remains, but the system bends, not breaks. The second future is prolonged uncertainty. Contracts are questioned, negotiations stall, China hesitates to escalate, the US tightens leverage through oil exports, investment freezes, Venezuela drifts governed but not stabilized. Then there is the darkest path. Agreements are voided, Chinese debts are sidelined, litigation replaces diplomacy, Beijing retaliates indirectly, using tools it has long held in reserve. The trade war deepens. Trust fractures. What determines the outcome is not oil, not even debt. It is whether power can coexist with restraint. This crisis exposes a truth China has tried to avoid. Economic influence without political security is fragile. And once that illusion breaks, the global system changes with it. Which brings us to the final question: what should we take away from this moment? This moment will be remembered not for the fall of one man, but for the lesson it delivered. Power still matters. Force still reshapes reality. And economic ties do not guarantee political safety. China believed patience, loans, and non-interference could secure influence. The United States demonstrated a different logic, one rooted in action, speed, and control. Neither approach is cost-free. Venezuela now stands as a warning to creditors who assumed stability, to governments who thought geography no longer mattered, to citizens who believed global order was governed by rules alone. For China, the question is no longer how to expand influence, but how to protect it. For the world, the question is more unsettling. What happens when power stops pretending to be subtle? If you want to understand where geopolitics is heading, not in theory, but in practice, this is where it begins. Follow this channel, share this analysis, and stay with me.